8 Game said, what's different from FC? That is a big question. There is a lot to talk about here. I will kind of give you our elevator pitch here. So what SaberSim does that is different from pretty much every optimizer out there on the market is that we simulate every single game on the slate thousands of times and use that to generate projections and our correlation values to build high upside, well-correlated lineups dynamically. So what I mean by that is that when we actually say Patrick Wisdom's projection is 11.86, what that is coming from is we are simulating the Cubs game thousands of times. We are plotting his real ranges of outcomes. These are the actual percentage of game sims where he scores different values. So we can see his score between 0 and 3 points happens 22% of the time. And so on, right? We get real ranges of outcomes for different players based on our game simulations. We can see exactly how correlated certain players are to other players in the order, right? This is a coefficient of correlation value for what Wisdom's correlation is with other hitters in the Cubs order. And then what we do is we leverage that simulation data to build strong lineups for the contests. So we have a correlation slider instead of having to set difficult stacking rules and trying to pick exactly which teams are going to be used for certain stacks and which players are going to be used as one-offs. We use a correlation slider here that takes into account how much to weight those correlation values to build effective stacks. We use an ownership fade slider here that, based on the contest you're selecting, will tell you exactly how much to weight the impact of our ownership projections. And we use smart diversity, which is probably the coolest thing in SaberSim, period. And what smart diversity does is it is a better alternative to randomness that you might see in a traditional optimizer. So a traditional optimizer, you may set a 20% randomness level, and that's going to basically open up a player's projection to 20% on either side of their mean projection. So for someone like Wisdom, 20% randomness would then say that his projection is randomly set somewhere between like 9 and 13 points for each lineup you build. But based on our simulation data and based on anyone that is familiar with baseball DFS, you know that's not really his real ranges of outcomes, right? He has a floor of 0, which happens most often, and a huge ceiling of numbers that get as high as 35, 40 points where he hits 2 home runs, right? So what smart diversity does instead is the higher this value is we will take small random subsets of our game simulations and use that to determine a player's projection for the lineup, which actually takes into account the real ranges of outcomes of players, the real floors and ceilings of certain players, and use that to create upside and diversity in your lineups. So what ends up happening here is we run these builds, and without setting any complicated rules at all, we get lineups that are correlated, that have the stacks that you would typically like to see in your lineups. You get lineups that naturally have the right leverage over the field in terms of ownership without having to set an ownership sum rule or anything like that. And we get lineups that have upside and are diverse and have exposures to certain players that make sense without having to go in and set minimum and maximum exposures and things like that for all of the different players on the slate. So without really having touched anything, right, we're letting this build run. I'll go ahead and show you here in a second what happens here. So without having set any kind of stacking rules, we're getting on DraftKings for tonight's slate, we're getting 4-3 stacks, 5 3s, 4 4s, 5 2s. We are getting exposures to certain players that, based on our smart diversity slider setting, we think makes sense for the particular contest. We're getting a player pool that is appropriately sized for the number of lineups we're playing and for the contest. And here's where it gets really cool. Instead of just building 20 lineups, when you ask for 20, we build a pool of 500 lineups so that you can interact with your lineup pool dynamically here without building any additional lineups. So maybe you finish this build and the first thing that pops out to you is, wow, this is way much Philly and Washington exposure for me. You can go ahead and say, I only want 50% exposure to some of these guys here post-build, and we will automatically sort through the pool of 500 lineups we built to give you our favorite 20 that are matching your exposure limits you set to certain players. So if we only want 50% maximum of any one batter, we can go ahead. That's a pitcher here. Let's go over to the batters tab. We can go ahead and set that live here. in the post-build process, and now we don't have any exposure to any batter over 50%. We can do it with the pitchers too. Maybe we want 75% exposure to Kenta Maeda instead. And it's going to go through, pick through the pool of 500 lineups, give us the best 20 based on the exposures we set. So there's a lot that's different from Fantasy Cruncher here. Without setting, I guess, quick summary, because we simulate every single game on the slate, we can build high upside lineups that are correlated, that are well leveraged against the field, because we simulate every single game, and then you can edit your exposures dynamically here on step 3, right? We created a pool here of 20 lineups that are going to have win equity in these contests, and so on. So I see a follow-up question. If the games are simmed thousands of times and then based on those projections, where's the initial data and projections coming from? One thing I will plug here to start is a few weeks ago, we had Matt and Will on this show here, and we did a full hour talking in detail about how our baseball model is made and some of the improvements we've made this season, how kind of the back end works there in terms of game simulations here. But essentially what we are doing is we are actually play-by-play simulating the game based on historical past probabilities of a certain outcome happening, right? So we will literally start the simulation with the leadoff hitter against the starting pitcher and taking into account that hitter's hit rates versus that pitcher's strikeout rates and the ballpark and the weather and the umpire, right? There are dozens of factors that go into this, and we are actually literally play-by-play for all of our sports simulating what outcome is likely to happen in the first play, and then in the second play, and the third. And I guess in baseball, maybe it's easier to think about this in terms of batters, right? And that's the way our kind of simulations are actually working. So there are a lot of other sites out there that are maybe claiming that they are simulating games, but as far as I'm aware, there's no one that's actually out there doing proper play-by-play simulations here of each game, and that is part of what makes it so powerful. So I will say real quick, let me go ahead actually real quick and show you guys this. I had this up on stream yesterday, but I just want to show you, since I've plugged YouTube a couple times, I want to show you exactly where to go. So let me go ahead and pull this up. So this is SaberSim's YouTube, right? I mentioned earlier the greatest hits playlist. This is right at the top. I don't know, Josh, if you're still here, but the video I was referring to is in here somewhere. I think there's something about stacking or basics of correlation in baseball where I talk a little bit more about some of what we were talking about before, but the video I am referring to is under the strategy sessions and how SaberSim's MLB model works. So we had Matt and Will on. Matt obviously built the whole thing. Will's been instrumental in helping us make some awesome improvements to our baseball model this season. This video is an hour long. They go into a lot of detail about how this all works and how the thing is put together. So definitely recommend checking that out if you're interested in more of how these game simulations and how our process works to generating these things. So